The rehearsal, paper 1 revision, theme confusion. Lesson objectives for the week. All learners will read an extract from the rehearsal by Eleanor Catton, answer exam-style reading questions on this text and do a piece of creative writing. The Rehearsal by Eleanor Catton, 2008. Thursday. That was at 4. At 5 there's another knock. The saxophone teacher opens the door. "Mrs. Winter," she says, "you've come about your daughter. Come in and we'll discuss carving her into half-hour slices to feed me week by week." She holds the door wide so Mrs. Winter can scuttle in. It's the same woman as before, just with a different costume. Winter, not Henderson. Some other things are different too, because the woman is a professional and she's thought about the role for a long time. Mrs. Winter smiles with only half her mouth. For example, Mrs. Winter keeps nodding a few seconds too long. Mrs. Winter inhales quietly through her teeth when she's thinking. They both politely pretend not to notice that it's the same woman as before. "To start off with," says the saxophone teacher as she hands her a mug of black leaf tea, "I don't allow parents to sit in on private lessons. I know it's a bit of an old-fashioned policy. The reason is partly that the students are never at their best in that sort of environment. They become flushed and hot, and they laugh too easily and their posture changes, folding up tight like the lips of a blossom. Partly also, I think, the reason I like to keep things very private is that these little half-hour slices are my chance to watch, and I don't want to share." "I'm not that sort of mother anyway," said Mrs. Winter. She's looking around her. The studio is on the attic level, and the view is all sparrows and slate. The brick wall behind the piano is chalky, the bricks peeling white, as if diseased. "Let me tell you about the saxophone," says the saxophone teacher. There is an alto saxophone on a stand next to the piano. She holds it up like a torch. The saxophone is a wind instrument, which means it's fueled by your breath. I think it's interesting that the word for breath in Latin is where we get our word spirit. People once had the idea that your breath and your soul were the same thing, that to be alive means merely to be filled with breath. When you breathe into this instrument, darling, you're not just giving it life, you're giving it your life. Mrs. Winter nods vigorously. She keeps nodding a few seconds too long. "I ask my students," the saxophone teacher says, "is your life a gift worth giving? Your normal, vanilla-flavoured life, your 2-minute noodles after school, your television until 10, your candles on the dresser and face wash on the sink?" She smiles and shakes her head. Of course it isn't, and the reason for that is that they simply haven't suffered enough to be worth listening to. She smiles kindly at Mrs. Winter, sitting with her yellow knees together and clutching her tea with both hands. "I'm looking forward to teaching your daughter," she says. "She seemed so wonderfully impressionable." "That's what we think," says Mrs. Winter quickly. The saxophone teacher observes her for a moment and then says, "Let's go back to that moment just before you have to refill your lungs, when the saxophone's full of your breath and you've got none left in your own body, the moment when the sax is more alive than you are. You and I, Mrs. Winter, know what it feels like to hold a life in our hands. I don't mean ordinary responsibility like babysitting or watching the stove or waiting for the lights when you cross the road. I mean somebody's life like a china vase in your hand." She holds her saxophone aloft, her palm underneath the bell. "And if you wanted, you could just let go." Question 1. Read again lines 5 to 10. List 4 things about Mrs. Winter. 4 marks. Stop the video and try and find 4 things about Mrs. Winter. Here I've highlighted that she's wearing a different costume. She smiles with only half her mouth. She keeps nodding a few seconds too long, and she inhales quietly through her teeth when she's thinking. Question 2. Read again lines 22 to 28 of the text. How does the writer use language to describe her feelings about playing the saxophone? 8 marks. Stop the video and try and find the quotations that you can use to answer this question. Remember to use the petal structure. Once you've found quotation, state what the quotation shows, make your point, what's happening. Write your quotation, which is your example, to show how the writer is achieving that. Decide on what part of grammar or technique is being used and name it, whether language or structural. So that's again a part of how the writer's doing it. And then state why the quotation contributes to your understanding. Explain what it could represent other than what's literally written on the pages, the implications, and that's your analysis or why the writer's written it. These are the quotations I picked out. Let me tell you about the saxophone. Like a torch, spirit, and you're giving it your life. Here's a model first paragraph for question 2, the language question. Firstly, the saxophone teacher is described as holding the saxophone using the simile like a torch. A torch could be a life-saving tool, allowing the user to find their way or an important object, to signal their location or call for help. In this way, the writer shows that the saxophone is an almost life-giving object for the teacher who cares for it and uses it reverently. This idea is repeated when she says that one's breath gives it your life. She treats it more than an inanimate object, but almost as a treasured and signature breathing animal. Task: write another paragraph to finish this answer. Question 3. You now need to think about the whole of the source. The text is from near the beginning of a novel. How has the writer structured the text to interest you as a reader? You could write about what the writer focuses your attention on at the beginning of the source, how and why the writer changes his focus as the source develops, and any other structural features that interest you. 8 marks. Try and find some quotations that support your point of view. Stop the video to find the quotations. Remember to use the petal structure. Once you've found quotation, state what the quotation shows, make your point, what's happening. Write your quotation, which is your example, to show how the writer is achieving that. Decide on what part of grammar or technique is being used and name it, whether language or structural. So that's again a part of how the writer's doing it. And then state why the quotation contributes to your understanding. Explain what it could represent other than what's literally written on the pages, the implications, and that's your analysis or why the writer's written it. Here are some quotations that you can use to support this question about structure. It starts with Thursday. That was at 4, there's another knock. And then we move on to a slightly worrying phrase, carving her into half-hour slices to feed me week by week. So the tone gets quite dark quite quickly. And then we find out that the same woman who came before is coming back again in a different costume. And she's thought about the role, so we begin to question what's going on. They're not noticing deliberately that it's the same woman as before, on line 11. And on line 13, I don't allow parents to sit in on private lessons. Well, that would raise the question, why? The teacher says that she likes to keep things private and she doesn't want to share, which again raises questions and keeps the reader interested. The teacher tells Mrs. Winter, "Let me tell you about the saxophone," as though she's about to start a history of the instrument, but she actually describes it as a living being, finishing in that paragraph of line 25 with, "You're not just giving it life, you're giving it your life," which is very strange. Mrs. Winter behaves strangely and apparently is nodding for far too long. And in the next paragraph, the teacher seems to discredit the experience of young people, saying that they simply haven't suffered enough to be worth listening to. And the word suffered really affects the tone of that paragraph. in a worrying way. The teacher makes a very strange comment that the girl who she has met previously seems very impressionable. And the focus comes back again in the next paragraph from line 40 to say that the saxophone seems to have its own life, especially when it's full of your breath. The tone in the last paragraph becomes very strange. She says that to hold a saxophone that's full of breath is like to hold a life in your hands. And in fact, you don't have to keep it alive. You could just let it go, which makes you think, how is she going to treat her students? Here is a model answer for question 3 about structure. Initially, the writer, after naming the day of the week, states that there is another knock, making the reader wonder who is knocking and why. We're in the middle of some unnamed activity and we want as readers to know what's happening. This acts as a narrative hook, and it's rapidly followed by the worrying and arresting statement, "We'll discuss carving her into half-hour slices to feed me week by week." This is obviously a reference to music lessons, but its sinister tone and semantic feel make the reader want to know about the nature of the teacher's and parents' motivation. Write another paragraph to finish this answer. Question 4. Focus this part of your answer on the last part of the source from line 30 to the end. A student said, "This part of the story where the saxophone teacher discusses her feelings about teaching adolescents the saxophone is very unsettling. To what extent do you agree? In your response, you could consider her attitude toward adolescents, evaluate how she expresses her attitude towards playing the saxophone, and support your answer with references to the text. 20 marks. Remember to use the petal structure. Once you've found quotation, state what the quotation shows, make your point, what's happening. Write your quotation, which is your example, to show how the writer is achieving that. Decide on what part of grammar or technique is being used and name it, whether language or structural. So that's again a part of how the writer's doing it. And then state why the quotation contributes to your understanding. Explain what it could represent other than what's literally written on the pages, the implications, and that's your analysis or why the writer's written it. Stop the video and look for quotations to support your answer to this question. The first quotation you could pick is your life a gift worth giving? That seems quite an extreme quotation for somebody who's about to start music lessons, to have to give your life to it. She's also quite dismissive of teenagers' lives, your normal vanilla flavoured life, vanilla being the most boring flavour of ice cream. And she says that teenagers haven't suffered enough to be worth listening to, which makes you wonder what she's going to put them through. She says that the girl whose mother has come is impressionable, and you wonder why. And her mother agrees, and you also wonder why. She goes on in line 43 to say that the saxophone is more alive than you are. Again, she seems to revere it as some kind of living god. And in the last dark paragraph, she refers to the life of the saxophone as something like a china vase, like the life of a child, and you could in fact just let it go, which is very unsettling. Here's a model first paragraph. The first unsettling statement we read in this section is your life worth giving? This rhetorical question alerts us to the fact that the teacher's motivation may be more sinister than a normal music teacher, and she at least expects an unusual and possibly unreasonable amount of commitment and effort from her students, and possibly something more, but it's not clear what. This leads the reader to question her intentions and the treatment of her students. Write 3 more paragraphs to finish this answer. Question 5. Either write a description suggested by this picture, or write a story opening about a situation of confusion. Set the scene vividly. 24 marks for content and organisation, 16 marks for technical accuracy, 40 marks. What confusion could there be? Maybe an unknown musician appears on stage. Maybe there's some unexpected or improvised music which works really well. Maybe some of the instruments are broken, so they have to improvise music using other materials. There could be audience participation where the audience takes over, perhaps, from the band. Maybe the audience are aliens. What else? Here's a quick reminder of things you need to think about when you're doing a description or a story. Try and do 5 paragraphs if you can. In your description, make a vocabulary list of words you can use for describing the scene using 5 senses and emotions. Don't forget the emotions. Try to use 3 different words for each feeling. Techniques are really important, so don't forget those language techniques. In your story, plan an interesting setting, for example, time or place, and your story doesn't have to be true, it just has to be well written. Plan your narrative hook, for example, a pronoun such as it in the first sentence. Plan your ordering. Where will it start? Will it start at the climax of the story? Will it start at the end? Will there be a flashback? Will there be foreshadowing earlier on? What will be your journey through the paragraphs? And include techniques such as simile, metaphor, alliteration and personification, as this imagery can bring your story to life. Congratulations, you've completed this lesson on Paper 1 revision.